In interwar Poland, he was the editor-in-chief of an extremely popular Catholic weekly called The Night of the Immaculate. That was an anti-Semitic rag that spilled hatred and venom, poisoned the minds and hearts of thousands upon thousands of Catholics who believed in this teaching of hatred, teaching of contempt, because it came from the institutional church. Indeed, from the Franciscan monks, the very example of love.
What he was writing at his time was probably what everyone was saying. We go back to the teaching of contempt, that he was probably, I've never seen any of his writings, I don't know anything about them, but was he not just writing what Catholics were writing and feeling at that time? What we are saying with the saint is, of course, that we believe that that person is in heaven, in paradise, and that something in a martyr, something in his life, it could only be at the last moment that happened, but that was enough.
Possibly, Father Kolbe changed his mind at Auschwitz, when he saw the logical, unavoidable implication of what he was teaching. I would hope so. Does this annul the teaching of hatred? How many Jews were denied help in Poland, hiding from the Nazis? Because people had read and had believed the Night of the Immaculate. And this too is something that is part of the moral accounting that Father Kolbe probably did in his own heart, but that the Catholic Church should have done when declaring him a saint.
In 1998, the Vatican finally released the Pope's long-awaited letter to the Jews, one of the most dramatic documents of his papacy. It declared that the 2,000-year relation between Christians and Jews was a tormented one. It acknowledged the failure of individual Christians to stand against the slaughter of Jews during World War II. It questioned whether anti-Judaic Christian teachings had contributed to the Holocaust. Welcomed by Jews and Christians alike, it was also criticized for not directly condemning the Catholic Church itself.
The paramount issue is the 2,000-year-long tradition of Christian contempt for Jews. That is what must change. John Paul II understands the importance of this change, I believe. He's been inhibited in his inability to go perhaps even as far with it as he'd like to. I think mostly because he has an idea of the church that doesn't admit easily the idea of change to it, and doesn't admit the idea of failure and of sin.
The obvious fact that Catholics have been in their millions anti-Semitic, and that Catholicism has been responsible for many of the atrocities against the Jews and for the whole anti-Semitic tradition. He knows that, and he's anxious to acknowledge that. But for him, there is an important theological difference between what millions of Catholics have done, the sins they've committed against the Jews, and what the Church has done. The Church is the spotless bride of Christ and does not commit sins. The institution staffed by sinful individuals does commit sins. But that theological distinction is something that, at the cost of plausibility in the modern world, he's struggling to preserve.
Idea was born in my mind. A concert to commemorate the Holocaust done in Rome, to which the Pope would be invited, would be a wonderful thing to do. I asked my mother-in-law about it, my touchstone in the Holocaust, because if she had said it was not a good idea, I wouldn't have done it. And she She said if it really could happen, it would be unbelievable. It would be a miracle. And I went to Rome, and I raised the issue with His Holiness, and the answer came back in 2 seconds. Va avanti. Go forward. Where my mother-in-law is from is Karwina, Ostrava, which is in a direct line from Krakow to Wadowice to the Czech border. Very close. They are from the same part of the world. And when they met, they spoke in Polish. And my mother-in-law looked up at him in a way that only they could talk to each other, because only they had lived this experience. He reached down into her soul, which was seared and charred with the ashes and with the smoke, the way she described the chimney and the smell. And she was in Auschwitz for 18 months or 2 years. She wasn't there for a month. And she smelled this and she lived it. And for him to be able to say, I know. I mean, just I know. I understand. I believe you. This was a transforming experience for her.
He must defend that which he has been called, and he believes certainly by divinity itself to serve the church. And on the other hand, he has to make peace with the wounded people, tortured people, to beat up people as it has never been beaten up in all its history, the Jews. The Jews, so many of whom he knew as a child in the town in which he was born, and that Polish town which was full of Jews, some of them his friends. And so there is the tragisme, there is the hurt in the heart, I think.
A visitor to the Kremlin reported that Joseph Stalin once asked dismissively, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" In 1945, Karol Wojtyła was a young seminarian and just starting the long journey that would one day answer Stalin's question.
In 1945, when the Second World War technically ends in Poland, the incoming Soviet army liberates some groups of people, but begins to oppress the general population in some ways more harshly than it had happened before. People in the West don't have any idea of the number of people who died after the war. Tens of thousands were rounded up and sent either to the Gulag or the prisons in Poland. These totalitarian conditions steamrolled everybody. It threw them on their inner psychological and spiritual resources. And as we know in Poland, that inner resistance proved much stronger than communism itself.
The Pope's interest in politics developed quite slowly and late. He came out of the occupation, I think, in a state of, not exactly denial, but I think he wanted to withdraw in different senses.
Young Father Wojtyła did want to withdraw into a monastery, but his superiors felt that he had other gifts and sent him into parish life. He led his students on treks into the wilderness. Some of the future leaders of Solidarity were on those camping trips, where they say Wojtyła taught them openness, honesty, and intellectual toughness.
Że to był taki w pełni mężczyzna.
He was all man. And as a woman I can say this.
100% mężczyzny.
He was 100% man.
Bycia ojcem.
But he was not a bachelor looking for girlfriends.
Dla panienki na przykład, tylko to był mężczyzna.
He was a father.
Ale naprawdę mężczyzna, to znaczy to nie był właśnie
But he was also not a priest with a sweet tone of voice and you know, so pious and shy or self-contained. No.
Although he was friendly, he was lonely. Definitely he was a lonely person. He would leave the group suddenly going aside and having his prayer time. I remember these times when he was suddenly leaving to concentrate and to pray. Then when he came back, he was charged with kind of energy, great intensity.
As a priest, in extremely difficult times, he had to look at the question of what was your relationship to the communist state going to be anyway? What should you do? You could go completely over the top and try and find the remaining anti-communist guerrillas fighting in the woods and join them. Right? That was out of the question. But then you could follow the great Cardinal Wyszynski, the primate. You could go into the complex business of negotiating concessions here in return for some concession from the state there, and be really intensely political, but all the time compromising. Certainly not a pretty sight to the Vatican, who, although people don't like to remember that now, the Vatican thought Wyszynski was a collaborator. They poured abuse on him because they thought he was selling out to the communists. Little did they know that in fact what he was doing was he was digging the church in to a position in which not only it would survive, but of course it would eventually be much tougher than the communist state.
1966 was Poland's millennial year. Primate Wyszynski organized a series of pilgrimages as a display of Catholic strength. He sent Wojtyła, now Archbishop of Krakow, to churches throughout the country. In this period, Wojtyła developed his political gifts. The actor now learned to speak to the nation. The director of small underground plays now mounted vast, complex productions fiercely resisted by the communists. The poet supported freedom of expression for writers and intellectuals. The altar boy negotiated with the communists and won permission to build new seminaries and churches.
At the time, it was thought that Wojtyła was more accommodating than Wyszynski. Wyszynski had the reputation of the doughty fighter who had refused to cooperate with the Stalinists, whereas Wojtyła was thought to be rather less confrontational, easier to do business with. It only shows how little communists understood the real nature either of Polish traditions or of the man, that Wojtyła could be warm, friendly, accommodating on the surface, but an iron determination under the surface.